I knew something was wrong the moment the cable beneath my boots shifted like a living muscle, tightening as if something far below had just noticed me. Down here in the Mariana Trench, nothing ever moves on its own. And yet that night was the first time I realized the 11 strange rules they gave me weren't just paranoia. I remember the first time I broke one of those rules. The water around me felt heavier, almost aware, and the line started trembling as if something was climbing up toward me. I never saw what reached for me in the dark, but I still feel its pull every time I close my eyes. I had always prided myself on staying calm under pressure, but that night, standing on the platform of the Mariana Trench, I realized how fragile courage can feel. Rule 1: never touch the cable if it moves on its own, wasn't just a precaution, it was a lifeline we were told never to break. The cable ran like a black ribbon into the depths below, shifting slightly as if it were breathing, and every time I thought of placing my hand on it, a shiver crawled up my spine. I whispered to myself, "It's fine, it's just steel," yet my heart pounded in panic as the shadows around the edge seemed to pulse with something unseen. The water beyond the platform shimmered faintly, reflecting the lights in unnatural patterns that made me doubt my own eyes. The first hour of inspection passed slowly, my flashlight illuminating the grooves in the cable that had been polished smooth by years of tension and pressure. I tried to focus on routine, checking connectors, reading meters, and ensuring nothing was frayed or bent. But the cable kept twitching, ever so slightly, as if testing me, reminding me of Rule 1. I told myself it was currents, or the subtle vibrations from the platform machinery, but deep down, I knew there was something more. Even my experienced hands shook, resisting the urge to touch it, because instinct screamed that even the slightest contact might trigger a reaction. Every creak of the platform made me jump, and I could almost swear the water below was watching, waiting for a mistake. Halfway through my check, a strange sensation crawled up my arm, like electricity running along the nerves. The cable had moved again, and though I hadn't touched it, I could feel a subtle pull, a tug that made my muscles tense involuntarily. I muttered to myself, "Stay back, don't touch it," repeating Rule 1 quietly, as if saying it aloud could anchor me to reality. I glanced around the empty platform, seeing the faint outline of the other cables stretching toward the abyss. Each one seemed calm compared to this main line, the one I'd been warned about since my first day on the job. It was like the ocean itself had chosen this cable to guard, to warn, and the warning was inescapable. Minutes turned into hours as I moved cautiously along the walkway, flashlight sweeping over bolts and junctions. I noticed tiny marks along the cable where metal scraped metal, as if some invisible entity had tested its strength before me. I felt a presence in the water, something patient and old, observing silently. The manual's warning came back to me in that moment. Rule 1: never touch the cable if it moves on its own. I thought about what would happen if I ignored it, and my mind conjured impossible images of being dragged into the trench, swallowed by the abyss, while the cable seemed to coil around me like a living snake. The thought made my pulse race, but I kept moving, never letting my hand stray near it. By midnight, the platform's lights were dim, flickering as if they were aware of the cable's agitation. I heard subtle vibrations that didn't match the machinery, soft hums that ran along the cable and into my boots. Every instinct screamed that the cable was alive, and even though I was trained to rely on instruments, my gut told me otherwise. I leaned against the railing, whispering Rule 1 again, and felt relief that I had obeyed it so far. The water below seemed darker than usual, almost black velvet, and the edges of my vision shimmered with movement I could not explain. I realized that breaking Rule 1 wasn't just a mistake, it could be fatal. Then something shifted sharply. A sudden jerk ran through the cable, sending vibrations up my arms and into my chest. I stumbled back, breathing heavily, and forced myself to remember Rule 1. The tug wasn't mechanical, it had purpose, intent, like it was testing me. I gritted my teeth and kept my hands firmly on the railing, unwilling to see what would happen if I reached out. I couldn't help but imagine what lay deep in the Mariana Trench. the unknown entities that had perhaps witnessed generations of divers, waiting for someone foolish enough to ignore the rules. My mind spun with visions of being yanked into the water, disappearing into an abyss no one could ever chart or escape. As the hours wore on, the cable seemed to calm, but the sense of being watched never left me. Every time I thought about touching it to adjust a connector, a flash of memory from a veteran diver's warning came back. Rule 1 is the only thing between you and the deep. I shivered, realizing how literal that warning had become. I worked slowly, meticulously, letting my flashlight lead the way while my hands stayed far from the cable. I whispered to myself again, Rule 1, and prayed that the caution alone would keep whatever lurked in the depths from noticing me. By the time my shift ended, I felt a strange exhaustion, like the ocean had drained more than just my energy. I reported the inspection, noting no damage, but I couldn't shake the memory of the subtle tug, the almost sentient shift beneath my boots. Walking back along the platform, I caught myself staring too long into the black water, imagining tendrils of the cable stretching down and out into the trench. I reminded myself silently, Rule 1, never touch the cable if it moves on its own, and promised I would obey it for the rest of my career, whatever that meant in this strange, hostile environment. That night, I slept fitfully in the small cabin, dreams filled with the cable writhing like a living creature, pulling and twisting toward me. Every time I woke, I could still feel its tug in my mind, a constant reminder that the rules weren't mere suggestions, they were survival. I knew I would never reach down to touch it again, not even in curiosity, because Rule 1 had already proven itself. And somewhere deep below, I sensed a patient awareness waiting for the next mistake. I could still feel my hands trembling from the previous tug of the main cable. And that's when I remembered Rule 2. Never disconnect the backup line under pressure, a warning that suddenly felt far more urgent than anything I had encountered before. The Mariana Trench platform creaked slightly under my boots, and the black water beyond the railing seemed to move with a life of its own, almost breathing beneath the dim lights. I hovered near the secondary line, the one installed to hold the main cable if tension ever became too much. But even the thought of touching it made my stomach knot. My flashlight flickered as shadows stretched unnaturally along the platform's edge, and every instinct screamed at me that this wasn't just metal and wiring. The trench had awareness, patience, and a long memory. I whispered to myself, do not touch it, do not disconnect it, letting Rule 2 sink in like a mantra for survival. The first hour was tense and silent, broken only by the faint hum of machinery and the low, rhythmic vibration from the cable. I carefully inspected connectors and tension gauges, forcing myself not to reach for the backup line even once. Every twitch in the main cable made me jump slightly, a reminder that the abyss below wasn't passive. I remembered stories told by senior divers of mysterious currents in cables that moved for no mechanical reason, always ending with a warning, Rule 2, never disconnect the backup line under pressure. I wondered what had happened to those who ignored it, though no one ever spoke of their fates openly. The water seemed to press against the platform as if sensing my hesitation, reminding me that the trench had its own rules, and breaking them was never forgiven. Minutes dragged into hours, the darkness outside deepening, the water swallowing every hint of light that escaped the platform. The backup line throbbed faintly, subtle at first, then with a stronger vibration that ran up my arms and into my chest. I could almost hear the tension in the metal, as if it was alive, anticipating my next move. Every rational explanation, currents, thermal expansion, minor platform sway, felt insufficient. The deeper I went into inspection, the more I realized that obeying Rule 2 wasn't about procedure. It was about survival, and the abyss wouldn't allow mistakes. My flashlight cut across the black water, catching on a loose bolt, a frayed wire, and even though everything seemed minor, I knew one wrong move could draw the attention of something waiting below. I tried to focus on the dials, the tension meters, everything to keep my mind busy, and my hands away from the backup line, but the vibrations kept intensifying, and I felt a subtle pull on the line, almost testing my restraint. I murmured Rule 2 again, letting it echo in my mind, each repetition a tether to sanity. Shadows along the platform's edge seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, and I could swear I caught the faintest movement in the water, like a dark shape lurking just out of sight. My heart hammered as I stepped carefully, aware that any sudden motion could trigger an encounter I didn't want. Every instinct screamed at me not to disconnect that line, but curiosity and fear were locked in battle inside me. Then a sudden surge of current hit the platform, shaking bolts and sending tiny sparks from nearby equipment. The main cable shifted violently, pulling against the backup line with a force that made me stagger back. I gritted my teeth and clenched the railing, reminding myself of Rule 2. My flashlight wavered as the tremor ran through the platform, and I imagined what would happen if I panicked and disconnected the line under such pressure. The thought alone made me sweat, every muscle taut, every nerve on fire. I could feel the deep pull of the abyss below, and it was more than just gravity or water pressure. It felt sentient, aware, testing me. Hours dragged on as I slowly moved along the platform, checking tension, bolts, and junctions. Every slight vibration in the backup line made my heart skip. I imagined the previous divers who might have ignored this rule, their fate sealed in the darkness below, and felt my resolve harden. Rule 2 wasn't just a guideline, it was a lifeline, and the consequences of breaking it were unimaginable. I reminded myself with each careful step that survival depended on restraint, not bravery, and that one impulsive move could be fatal. The trench was patient, but it never forgot, and I knew it was observing every hesitation, every twitch of my muscles, every glance at the secondary line. By midnight, the currents had grown stronger, buffeting the platform with greater intensity. The backup line pulsed rhythmically, almost in time with my own heartbeat, a sinister reminder that obeying Rule 2 was the only thing keeping me anchored to life. Shadows stretched across the deck, as if the darkness itself had weight, pressing in, measuring my focus. I imagined what would happen if I faltered, if my curiosity overcame caution, the line snapping, the main cable jerking, and the abyss opening to claim me. I felt sweat trickle down my spine, my fingers twitching despite every effort to stay still. Every sound of the shifting water or vibrating metal felt amplified, like a warning I couldn't ignore. At one point, I accidentally leaned too close to the backup line, and it pulsed sharply under my touch, even though I hadn't gripped it. I recoiled immediately, whispering Rule 2 like a prayer, feeling a cold shiver run from my hands to my chest. The line had warned me, and I knew the trench would remember if I tested it again. My flashlight caught on the faint outline of the abyss below, the black water almost alive with movement, and I realized I couldn't allow fear to tempt me into mistakes. The backup line was more than a safety measure, it was a boundary, a line between the living and the unknown. By the end of my shift, every step had been cautious, deliberate, and tense. I reported that all lines were intact, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched, of the cable remembering every twitch, every glance, every near mistake. I slept fitfully in the small cabin, the vibration of the backup line still echoing in my mind, imagining dark shapes coiling around the cables below. The first time I had ignored a subtle warning, I understood Rule 2 in a way no training manual could teach. Every fiber of my being knew that tomorrow, and the days after, I would obey this rule without hesitation, because the trench was patient, and the abyss never forgives. The moment I stepped back from the vibrating backup line, I remembered Rule 3. Always check for pressure anomalies before approaching any moving cable. A warning that suddenly made the dim glow of the platform lights feel insufficient. The water beyond the railing seemed to thicken, almost slow in its motion, and I could feel the metal beneath my boots hum with an energy I couldn't explain. Every fiber of my being told me to pause, to assess the pressure gauges and environmental readings before even thinking of moving closer to the cables. I whispered to myself that one wrong move could set off a chain reaction in the trench, and Rule 3 was the only safeguard between careful observation and disaster. I cautiously examined the gauges along the side of the platform, tracing the faint lines of digital readouts and mechanical indicators that told me more than words ever could. The pressure readings were slightly higher than normal, subtle enough that someone without experience might have ignored them. My flashlight traced the backup line, illuminating the small tremors that had set my nerves on edge all night. I recalled senior divers' warnings about pressure anomalies, how even the tiniest shift could amplify the power of a moving cable, and I realized that Rule 3 was a rule born of countless unspoken tragedies. My chest tightened as I imagined what would happen if I ignored it, and every instinct screamed that the abyss below was watching, waiting. Hours passed as I carefully noted fluctuations, recording the smallest changes in pressure, tension, and vibration. Every twitch of the main cable seemed synchronized with my heartbeat, making me question whether the machinery or something else was controlling the shifts. I repeated Rule 3 in my mind like a mantra, reminding myself to always assess before moving closer, to never approach without understanding the environment I was stepping into. The Mariana Trench felt alive tonight, its darkness thicker and more deliberate, like a creature aware of my hesitation. Even the familiar hum of the platform seemed to have a rhythm I hadn't noticed before, as though it were responding to my movements and measuring my resolve. At one point, a surge of current pressed against the platform, forcing me to lean into the railing to avoid being knocked off balance. I could feel the pressure transmit through the metal, through the backup line, and into my chest. I thought about how close I had come to ignoring the previous rules, how quickly disobedience could escalate into disaster. The lights above flickered and cast shifting shadows along the deck, emphasizing the depth and darkness below. I whispered Rule 3 again, letting it anchor me, reminding myself that every observation, every careful check, was not just a task, but a shield against the unknown. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally as I moved along the platform, every step deliberate, every glance toward the abyss measured. The backup line pulsed intermittently, a quiet, sinister reminder of the energy coursing beneath. I imagined the consequences of approaching the cable without checking pressure anomalies: a sudden rupture, a violent jerk, a pull that could drag me into the void below. My fingers itched to reach out, to adjust a connector, but I resisted, murmuring Rule 3 to remind myself that caution was survival. The deeper I went, the more the water seemed to thicken, the shadows below shifting in ways that no ordinary light could explain. Hours merged as I meticulously noted fluctuations, tracing each twitch and tremor, feeling the weight of the abyss pressing in with every movement. The platform groaned under the pressure of water and metal, the vibration carrying through the rails and into my boots. Every reading I took seemed to pulse with a life of its own, almost as if the cables themselves were aware of my scrutiny. I whispered Rule 3 one last time as I moved to the far end of the platform, and a shiver ran down my spine when I realized that the trench had observed every hesitation, every glance, every near mistake. The backup line remained intact, yet the awareness of the depths below lingered, patient and unyielding. By the end of the shift, exhaustion weighed heavily on me, yet my mind remained alert, each nerve ending alive with tension. The Mariana Trench, vast and dark, seemed to stretch endlessly, reminding me that the rules were not suggestions, they were shields. I slept fitfully in the cabin that night, dreams filled with cables pulsing and shifting beneath immense pressure, always reminding me of Rule 3. I knew that tomorrow, and every day after, my survival would depend on adhering to these rules with absolute precision. And somewhere below, the abyss waited, patient, measuring my obedience, and ready to punish even the slightest lapse. I had barely finished double-checking the pressure gauges when the thought hit me. Rule 4. Never enter a restricted area without notifying the surface team. And suddenly the narrow passage ahead of the platform seemed impossibly long. The dim emergency lights flickered along the corridor, casting uneven shadows over metal grates slick with condensation, and I could feel the dark water pressing in from every side. My heart pounded as I imagined what could be waiting in the restricted zones below. Areas marked off for emergencies or maintenance that no diver had ventured into alone. I whispered the rule to myself, feeling the weight of obedience pressing down as heavily as the trench itself. Moving forward without permission was unthinkable. Not because of protocol, but because the abyss had rules far older than any human law. The platform shuddered slightly under the increasing currents, and I knew that the restricted areas had cables and machinery I barely understood. I inched closer to the entry hatch, flashlight illuminating warning signs in yellow stripes, and every nerve in my body screamed to stop. The water beyond seemed darker, denser, almost viscous, and I could feel a subtle vibration running up my boots from the platform. Obeying Rule 4 wasn't just about radioing the surface. It was about acknowledging that some parts of the trench were not meant for unprepared eyes. Even imagining stepping through without notice felt like breaking an unspoken pact with the abyss itself, a silent invitation to disaster. I paused to communicate with the surface team, the static-filled radio crackling faintly as I transmitted my status. Team, I'm approaching the restricted corridor, beginning inspection under standard protocol, I said, my voice steady even though adrenaline surged through me. The platform responded with slow acknowledgments, confirming that I was cleared but under surveillance, and I felt a thin thread of safety stretch between me and the surface. The thought of the unknown lurking behind the hatch was suffocating. I repeated Rule 4 under my breath, a silent prayer that keeping them informed would be enough to protect me from what waited in the shadows. Every step into the corridor felt heavier than the last, as if the water outside wanted to push me back, to force compliance. Pipes and cables snaked along the walls, humming faintly, resonating with tension from the main and backup lines I had just inspected. I could hear subtle shifts in metal and machinery that were impossible to identify, and my imagination began painting them as living entities, eager for the slightest misstep. I reminded myself of Rule 4, feeling the psychological weight of entering a place humans were warned to avoid, knowing full well that obeying the rule wasn't just procedure, it was survival. The further I moved, the more the platform seemed to change around me. Shadows elongated along the walls, water currents outside the portholes became erratic, and I began hearing faint vibrations that didn't match any machinery. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to retreat, but the inspection required me to proceed carefully, flashlight sweeping methodically over every surface. I whispered Rule 4 quietly, grounding myself, acknowledging that the surface team's awareness was the only thing keeping the abyss from noticing me fully. The tension was palpable. Even breathing felt like it could disturb the fragile balance between obeying the rule and tempting disaster. Minutes stretched like hours as I navigated the narrow passage, checking valves, junctions, and cables, noting every irregularity in my log. The restricted area contained systems far more sensitive than anything on the main platform, and the slightest misstep could cascade into failure. I imagined what could happen if I had ignored Rule 4, if I had entered silently and unknowingly triggered some automated defense or imbalance. The thought alone made my muscles tense. The vibration from the cables outside the corridor seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat, as if the trench itself was aware of my every decision. Halfway through the corridor, a sudden thrum ran along the floor, subtle but undeniable, and I froze. My flashlight flickered over the metal grates, illuminating shadowy shapes that vanished the instant I blinked. I reminded myself of Rule 4, acknowledging that notifying the surface team had not just been about protocol, but about alerting something far older, far more aware than any human could comprehend. The water outside pressed like a living weight, and even the smallest noise, the clink of my tools or the scrape of metal, seemed amplified, resonating through the trench as if the abyss listened. Hours passed in a blur as I continued forward, every inch deliberate, every observation meticulous. I could feel exhaustion creeping in, but the thought of violating Rule 4 kept me alert, aware, alive. The restricted zone systems pulsed faintly, subtle lights blinking on panels I barely understood, each a reminder that the trench was a carefully balanced ecosystem of pressure, machinery, and unseen observers. My breathing was steady but shallow, the flashlight beam slicing through the thick shadows, and I could almost feel eyes tracking my every move. Obedience to Rule 4 was the only shield I had, a fragile barrier against the patience of the abyss below. By the time I reached the far end of the corridor, tension ran through my veins like electricity. The restricted systems were intact, the cables humming with minimal disturbance, but the shadows in the water beyond seemed to ripple unnaturally. I transmitted my status to the surface team, my voice steady despite the adrenaline, and felt the thin reassurance of being monitored. Still, the knowledge of what could have happened if I ignored Rule 4 made my hands shake, and the sensation of the abyss pressing just beyond the walls lingered long after I left the corridor. That night, every creak of the platform and ripple of the water reminded me that some places were forbidden for a reason, and Rule 4 had just proven it. The moment I left the restricted corridor, exhaustion weighed heavily on me, and I immediately remembered Rule 5. Always maintain visual contact with at least one teammate when navigating unstable sections, a rule that suddenly felt more crucial than any other. The platform stretched endlessly before me, dark patches of water reflecting faint emergency lights that seemed to tremble with every movement. I scanned the walkway, hoping to see a familiar silhouette or a reflective helmet light, but the trench was empty, except for me. Every step felt precarious as I reminded myself that being alone in unstable sections could allow the abyss itself to claim a moment of weakness. My flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating pipes, cables, and metal beams that groaned subtly under the pressure of the Mariana Trench. The vibration from the main cables beneath my boots pulsed steadily, a quiet reminder that the trench wasn't passive, that even in empty sections the cables held an awareness I couldn't see. I tried to calculate my path, moving slowly, keeping my flashlight beam trained on every inch ahead. The absence of any teammate intensified my anxiety, and I whispered Rule 5 to myself, acknowledging that visual contact wasn't just protocol, it was the only tether to life in areas prone to collapse or sudden movement. The shadows along the platform stretched and shifted in ways that seemed deliberate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the trench was testing my obedience to the rules. Halfway through the unstable section, the platform groaned beneath a subtle surge of water currents, and I stumbled slightly, gripping the railing. I imagined what could happen if a misstep sent me toward the abyss, isolated and unmonitored, and felt the chilling truth of Rule 5. My flashlight caught a glint along the edge of the main cable, and for a moment I thought I saw a dark shape moving beneath the surface, far too deliberate to be a normal current. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, moving cautiously while scanning for any teammate or signal. The trench was patient, but it remembered every hesitation, and I knew that breaking Rule 5 even unknowingly could have consequences I wasn't prepared for. I continued inching forward, meticulously checking each step, every joint and every cable, all while imagining what could be lurking in the shadows beyond my light. The platform felt narrower as I advanced, the grooves in the metal wet and slippery from condensation. I whispered Rule 5 repeatedly in my mind, trying to anchor myself to the concept of being observed and connected, even though I was alone. Every vibration, every subtle hum of machinery seemed amplified, as if the trench itself could sense my isolation. I realized that being out of visual contact wasn't just dangerous, it was an invitation to the unseen forces below. Hours passed, each movement deliberate, every glance toward the shadows layered with tension. The Mariana Trench stretched endlessly, water beyond the railing, thick and black, moving slowly in ways that defied natural currents. I imagined the abyss watching, evaluating my obedience to Rule 5, testing whether I would remain vigilant or allow fear to make me careless. My flashlight cut across the narrow walkway, illuminating subtle distortions in metal and cable, each one a reminder that the trench had its own rules, independent of human logic. I forced myself to stay alert, aware that one slip, one misstep, or even 1 second of distraction could cost me everything. Then the platform shivered unexpectedly, sending a ripple through the cables and metal beneath me. I froze, recalling Rule 5 and imagining how a teammate nearby could have helped steady me, providing guidance or warning. The isolation felt heavier than the water pressing against the platform, The shadows outside seemed to move closer, the vibrations increasing in intensity. My mind raced with scenarios of being dragged or knocked off balance, imagining the deep, dark water swallowing me whole if I faltered. I whispered Rule 5 again, a mantra to maintain focus, to remind myself that obedience and awareness were the only shields I had. By the time I reached the far end of the unstable section, every muscle in my body was taut with tension, yet I had successfully navigated the entire path without incident. I reported my position to the surface team, my voice steady but my heart still racing from the isolation. The lights flickered slightly, shadows shifting along the platform, as if to remind me that being alone was dangerous. Even though I had made it through without touching anything or tripping, I knew that Rule 5 was proven yet again. Survival depended on maintaining contact, vigilance, and awareness. My mind replayed every vibration, every twitch of the cables, and every subtle hum of machinery, reminding me that the trench would never forgive carelessness. That night, as I tried to rest in the small cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. Every creak of the platform and pulse of the backup line echoed in my mind, reminding me of Rule 5 and the unseen dangers that lurked just beyond the edge of my vision. Even in sleep, my thoughts were drawn to the empty walkway, the shadows of the trench, and the knowledge that disobedience, or even a moment of distraction, could invite consequences that no diver had survived. I knew that tomorrow, and every day after, I would never forget to maintain visual contact in unstable areas, because the abyss below was patient, precise, and unforgiving. Even after surviving the unstable section, a lingering unease clung to me as I remembered Rule 6. Never ignore unusual vibrations in the support beams, and I immediately scanned the platform with renewed tension. The beams beneath my boots hummed softly, a low, irregular pulse that set my nerves on edge. I ran my fingers lightly along the metal railing, feeling subtle shifts that no ordinary machinery could explain. Every creak, every shiver in the steel seemed deliberate, as though the Mariana Trench itself was alive and testing my resolve. I whispered Rule 6 under my breath, knowing that neglecting even the faintest warning could awaken forces far older than humanity. The deeper I moved along the platform, the stronger the vibrations became, almost like a heartbeat resonating through the metal. I could see faint reflections in the water, shadows stretching across the portholes in unnatural angles. Each pulse of the beam synchronized eerily with the subtle thrum of the main and backup cables, and I realized that Rule 6 was about more than structural integrity. It was about survival. Ignoring these vibrations could be a mistake no one would live to correct. I leaned close, inspecting the bolts and joints, but even my flashlight couldn't penetrate the blackness beyond the platform, where unseen movements twisted the water into darker, denser shapes. Hours passed as I traced every tremor, every shiver along the beams, meticulously recording and analyzing the data. The vibrations seemed almost sentient, as if they were communicating something I couldn't yet understand. I repeated Rule 6 quietly, reminding myself that the rule wasn't a suggestion, it was a lifeline. The platform groaned under the shifting currents, and the cables above pulsed in response, almost like a warning to proceed cautiously. The trench had its own rhythm, one that I was barely beginning to perceive, and every violation of the rule risked awakening an awareness that could pull me into the abyss without mercy. At one point, a sudden surge of current caused the beams to vibrate sharply beneath me, sending a jolt through my body. I stumbled slightly but forced myself to remain calm, whispering Rule 6 again as I steadied my hands on the railing. The vibrations didn't stop. They intensified, running along the platform, twisting metal and echoing through the water beyond. I could imagine what might happen if I ignored them: a catastrophic shift, a snap in the beams, or some unseen entity emerging from the shadows to exploit my mistake. The Mariana Trench seemed alive, patient and calculating, testing my every instinct with subtle, deliberate pressure. Minutes turned into hours as I painstakingly continued along the platform, feeling the pulse of the beams with every step. Shadows danced in the dim emergency lights, distorting my perception, making the water outside appear thicker and more deliberate. I imagined previous divers who might have ignored this warning, lost to the abyss without anyone left to recount their fate. Rule 6 became a mantra, a shield and a tether to life itself. Each subtle vibration reminded me that the trench was patient but merciless, and that even one ignored pulse could unravel everything I had fought to maintain. The isolation in the platform corridors amplified every sensation, every creak, every hum of machinery. I could feel the vibrations transferring through my boots into my spine, and I shivered despite my heavy suit. I imagined the deep, dark water beyond the railing, pressing against the steel, patient, deliberate, waiting for the slightest lapse. Whispering Rule 6, I moved methodically, scanning every joint, every weld, every shadow cast by the flickering lights. The cables above and the beams below seemed to vibrate in tandem, a subtle language of tension that I had to interpret to survive. By midnight, the vibrations had intensified to a rhythmic pulse that seemed almost conscious, testing my focus, measuring my resolve. I paused, gripping the railing tightly, trying to steady my mind as the platform creaked and the water swirled in impossible patterns beyond the portholes. I imagined the abyss noticing any hesitation, ready to punish mistakes. Rule 6 had proven itself again. Even subtle signs, unnoticed or ignored, could trigger consequences beyond comprehension. The black water waited silently, patient and ancient, a presence I could feel but never see. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the far end of the unstable section. Every vibration had been traced, every anomaly recorded, and yet the sense of being watched never left me. The platform remained intact, the cables pulsing faintly in the background, but the knowledge of what could have happened if I had ignored Rule 6 weighed heavily on me. I transmitted my findings to the surface team, my voice steady but my hands still trembling, knowing that disobedience would have been catastrophic. That night, sleep was fitful, my dreams filled with pulsing beams and cables, all reminding me that the abyss was patient, precise, and unforgiving. As I stepped away from the vibrating support beams, a cold dread settled over me, and I immediately recalled Rule 7. Never override the automatic tension locks on the main cable. A rule that now felt more like a lifeline than a guideline. The main cable above hummed faintly, its energy palpable beneath the dim emergency lights, and I could feel the subtle thrum travel through the platform into my boots. Every instinct screamed that the locks were there for a reason, far beyond mechanical failure, that the trench itself would punish anyone foolish enough to tamper with them. My flashlight illuminated the cable junctions ahead, revealing the intricate web of wires, locks and pulleys that kept the abyss at bay, and I whispered Rule 7 to myself, as if repeating it could ward off disaster. I inched closer to the main cable junction, careful to observe without touching anything, my hands shaking slightly from both tension and exhaustion. The vibrations from the backup line and the support beams seemed to synchronize with the main cable, creating a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. Each pulse felt deliberate, almost aware, and I remembered stories of divers who had overridden the locks, never returning to tell what happened. Rule 7 was not just about machinery, it was about survival, about respecting a force older and more patient than any human logic. The Mariana Trench stretched infinitely around me, black water pressing against every edge of the platform, and I felt the weight of obedience more heavily than the steel beneath my boots. Hours passed as I cautiously examined the cable, inspecting each tension lock, each connector, each wire in painstaking detail. The platform creaked softly beneath me, and I could hear subtle, almost inaudible hums from the machinery that made my skin prickle. I imagined what would happen if I ignored Rule 7, if curiosity or impatience made me reach for a lock, how the cable might jerk violently, how the abyss below might take notice, and how there would be no one to save me. The lights flickered, shadows danced, and the black water beyond seemed to thicken, pressing against the platform with an almost sentient awareness. I whispered Rule 7 again, letting it echo in my mind as both warning and reassurance. Suddenly, a stronger surge of current hit the platform, sending a ripple through the main cable that made every bolt and pulley vibrate. I froze, gripping the railing, acutely aware that even the slightest interference with the locks could trigger disaster. My flashlight swept across the junctions again, the shadows exaggerating every detail, and I realized that Rule 7 was about trust. Trusting the mechanisms, trust in the rules, and trust in forces beyond human comprehension. Each vibration felt like a heartbeat, a reminder that the abyss was patient, watching, and capable of remembering even the smallest infraction. Step by step, I moved along the cable path, monitoring every twitch, every pulse, every faint hum of the metal and machinery. The trench seemed to thicken around me, as if it were aware of my presence, testing my adherence to Rule 7. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the emergency lights, and faint patterns of movement in the water made it clear that I was being observed. My pulse quickened as I imagined the consequences of disobeying: sudden cable tension release, structural collapse, or something far older and unseen taking notice. I whispered Rule 7 to ground myself, reminding myself that these locks were more than metal. They were the boundary between life and oblivion. Hours stretched further as I meticulously inspected every connection and tension lock. Each one held, humming faintly, as if satisfied with my obedience. But I knew better than to relax. The platform seemed to shift subtly under the pressure of the deep water, and the shadows outside twisted in ways that no ordinary light could explain. I imagined divers who had ignored Rule 7, their fate sealed in the darkness beyond the railings, and felt my resolve strengthen. Each vibration and pulse was a test of patience and focus, a reminder that the trench punished the curious and the reckless without mercy. By midnight, every inch of the cable path had been checked, and the locks remained intact, humming with faint energy. The platform creaked in response to the currents, and I could feel the subtle pressures through my boots, as if the abyss below measured every hesitation. I transmitted a careful report to the surface team, knowing that my survival depended as much on communication as on adherence to Rule 7. Shadows in the black water lingered unnaturally, and every vibration of the main cable reminded me that even the smallest lapse could result in consequences too terrible to imagine. Obedience to Rule 7 had kept me alive tonight, but the trench remained patient, its memory long and unforgiving. Finally, I retreated to the safer section of the platform, still alert, every nerve taut with awareness. The main cable pulsed gently in the background, shadows rippling across the portholes, and I whispered Rule 7 one last time. Sleep was impossible. Dreams were filled with snapping tension locks, plunging cables, and the patient eyes of the abyss watching from the black water. I knew that every day I returned, Rule 7 would remain a line I could not cross, a boundary between life and something far older, far more deliberate than any human. I had barely retreated to the safer section of the platform when a faint but insistent shudder ran through the metal beneath my boots, and I immediately remembered Rule 8. Never attempt repairs during unexplained tremors. A cautionary echo from every diver's nightmare. The emergency lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows along the deck, while the dark water outside the portholes seemed to ripple unnaturally, almost in anticipation. My fingers itched to adjust a connector or tighten a loose bolt, but I forced myself to stand still, letting the vibrations pass through the platform without interference. Every instinct screamed that trying to fix anything now would be a direct challenge to forces I could not comprehend, and Rule 8 suddenly felt more like survival than procedure. The tremors grew in intensity, subtle at first, then stronger, making the platform groan as metal stretched and cables hummed with tension. I could see faint patterns in the water beyond the railing, dark shapes moving just out of clear sight, and the fear that had been gnawing at me since the first vibration in Rule 6 flared anew. I reminded myself of Rule 8, repeating it quietly, feeling the words anchor me against the urge to interfere. The Mariana Trench around me seemed alive, patient, calculating, and I realized that any misstep during these tremors could draw attention I didn't want. The very air felt heavier, as if the abyss itself were pressing against my chest, measuring every breath, every twitch, every glance. I shuffled along the platform cautiously, flashlight slicing through the black water and illuminating the trembling beams, the vibrating cables, and the intricate locks I had meticulously inspected under Rule 7. Every pulse in the metal beneath me resonated through my body, and I imagined the consequences if I had ignored Rule 8, reaching impulsively to repair something mid-shutter. A violent jerk could snap cables, dislodge support beams, or worse, awaken something lurking in the shadows beyond the lights. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the railing, whispering Rule 8 over and over to steady my hands and mind, acknowledging that survival depended on patience, observation, and restraint. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the faint hum of machinery and irregular thuds from the platform's distant sections. Each tremor seemed purposeful, testing my resolve and my adherence to the rule. I reminded myself again of Rule 8, understanding that these tremors were a warning, a subtle communication from the trench itself, one I could not afford to ignore. Every shadow cast by the emergency lights seemed to twist with intent, and even the faintest ripple in the water felt like a movement calculated to measure my response. The thought of making a hasty repair was terrifying, because the abyss had patience, and it remembered everything. At one point, the tremors intensified sharply, shaking the platform violently enough to send sparks from nearby machinery and make my flashlight waver. I froze, gripping the metal railing with white-knuckled hands, and repeated Rule 8 in my mind. The vibrations traveled up through the beams, the backup line pulsed faintly in resonance, and the main cable above groaned like it was alive. I could imagine the disaster that would ensue if I ignored the tremors. Snapping lines, plunging platforms, or unseen hands reaching from the darkness to exploit my lapse. Every instinct screamed that obedience, not action, was the only path to survival. Minutes bled into hours as the tremors continued sporadically, some subtle, some alarming, each one testing my patience, my focus, and my nerve. I moved slowly, documenting the vibrations, noting changes in intensity and frequency, but I never touched a single connector, never attempted to stabilize a bolt, and never let curiosity override Rule 8. The trench seemed to thicken outside the portholes, water blacker and heavier, as if aware that I was obeying, yet watching for any sign of faltering. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the platform, and faint noises echoed through the deck, subtle creaks and hums that no human could have produced. I whispered Rule 8 again, clinging to it like a lifeline, knowing that each tremor was a test of restraint and survival. By midnight, I had traced every vibration along the platform, following the subtle pulses through beams, cables, and metal supports, careful to remain vigilant without touching anything. The platform shifted beneath me with every pulse, but I maintained focus, knowing that one wrong move could trigger a chain reaction of disaster. The water outside seemed to ripple in patterns I couldn't comprehend, shapes gliding just beyond the edge of light, testing my attention and discipline. Obeying Rule 8 was exhausting, mentally and physically, yet I understood that my survival depended entirely on this unwavering caution. Finally, as the tremors subsided slightly, I allowed myself a tentative breath, feeling the tension in every muscle begin to ease. I documented the anomalies in the log, transmitting the details to the surface team with a voice steadier than I felt. Shadows lingered along the walls, the cables hummed faintly above me, and every vibration reminded me of the abyss's patience, its meticulous observation, and its unforgiving nature. Even as I attempted to rest later, I could feel the tremors echoing in my dreams, and the rule that had kept me alive, Rule 8, remained etched into my mind, a silent reminder that some actions must always be deferred until the abyss allowed it. As the tremors finally subsided, I stepped into the faint glow of the next section and immediately remembered Rule 9. Always monitor oxygen levels closely when near active machinery, a rule I had ignored once before and paid dearly for in nerves. The machinery hummed with low, constant vibrations, pipes rattling softly, as though the trench itself was breathing. My tank pressure readings flickered slightly on the heads-up display, subtle enough to be overlooked, but my instincts screamed that even a minor lapse could become fatal here. I whispered Rule 9 to myself, scanning the gauges repeatedly, aware that the black water outside pressed against the platform like a living weight, waiting for the slightest mistake. Every flicker of light and shadow seemed amplified, as if the abyss measured my awareness and rewarded precision. I inched closer to the machinery, careful to avoid brushes against wires, valves, and control panels, all the while monitoring the oxygen readings with a meticulous eye. The vibrations beneath my boots, though faint, resonated through the platform and into my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. I reminded myself that Rule 9 was more than a safety measure. It was a lifeline. A slight drop in oxygen, while dealing with active machinery, could easily lead to mistakes, and mistakes here were not forgiven. The Mariana Trench felt suffocatingly alive tonight, the black water outside undulating in unnatural patterns, shadows stretching and twisting, as if they were aware of my every movement. Hours passed as I traced every valve and panel, recording subtle fluctuations in both machinery, vibrations, and oxygen readings. Each adjustment I considered making was delayed by the knowledge that Rule 9 demanded unwavering attention. Even a split-second distraction could reduce my air supply without warning, and in the abyss, seconds were measured in life or death. I felt the weight of the trench around me, a pressing presence that seemed to know if I faltered. Every pulse of the main cables, every subtle hum from the backup line, reminded me that survival was as much about observation as it was about skill. Suddenly, a minor surge in one of the pumps made the platform shudder slightly, sending vibrations along the beams and rattling the adjacent pipes. My heart skipped, and I instinctively checked my oxygen, grateful to see the levels holding steady. I whispered Rule 9 to myself, grounding my nerves, knowing that if I had looked away for even a moment, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Shadows flickered in the black water outside, moving against the faint glow of emergency lights, making it seem as though unseen eyes were following my every move. The thought of what could happen if oxygen ran low while near these machines made every decision critical, every hesitation a risk. Minutes became hours as I continued my inspection, flashlight sweeping the machinery and instruments, while monitoring every slight change in my air supply. The vibrations from the main and backup cables pulsed steadily beneath me, a reminder of the trench's omnipresence and patience. I imagined previous divers who may have ignored Rule 9, and a chill ran down my spine at the thought of being incapacitated, alone and observed by forces I couldn't comprehend. Each rise and dip in oxygen levels felt like a warning from the abyss, a subtle communication that required both caution and respect. The machinery groaned as currents shifted around the platform, sending minor jolts through the structure and amplifying the vibrations beneath my boots. I paused to take note of subtle changes in pressure and temperature, all while keeping a careful eye on my oxygen gauges. Rule 9 became a mantra, a tether between my survival and the patience of the trench. Every shadow outside the platform seemed alive, moving with purpose, and even the smallest change in oxygen could render me vulnerable. I whispered the rule under my breath repeatedly, using it to steady my hands as I adjusted minor components without overextending myself. Hours dragged on, my senses stretched thin, as I maintained constant vigilance over machinery, cables, and air supply. Every flicker of light or tremor in the platform made me pause, rechecking oxygen, recalibrating my awareness, and visualizing the consequences of disobedience. The Mariana Trench loomed all around, patient, observant, and silent, its dark presence pressing against the structure, as if measuring my focus. Rule 9 was more than a guideline. It was an invisible hand guiding each breath, each movement, each calculation. Finally, after meticulously monitoring every gauge and pulse of the platform, I made my way back to a more stable section. My oxygen levels were steady, the machinery calm, but I could still feel the pressure of the abyss beyond the railings. Shadows lingered in the water, subtle vibrations continued beneath the beams, and I knew that the rules, like Rule 9, existed because the trench remembered, it observed, and it punished carelessness. I transmitted a detailed report to the surface team, my voice steady but my body still trembling from exhaustion. The awareness that even minor lapses could be fatal settled over me like a heavy cloak, reminding me that survival here demanded both patience and vigilance. That night, as I tried to rest in the cabin, every sound of the platform and faint pulse of the cables echoed in my dreams. I could feel the black water pressing close, and every flicker of shadow reminded me that Rule 9 had been the difference between life and the abyss. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by imagined scenarios where a misread gauge or a diverted glance had ended differently. The Mariana Trench remained patient, infinite, and unforgiving, and I knew that the lessons of Rule 9 would follow me into every shift, every inspection, every breath I took in the crushing darkness below. The hum of the platform still resonated in my chest as I glanced at the sonar screens, and a sudden ping caught my attention, making me immediately recall Rule 10. Never approach unknown signals on the sonar without backup. The signal pulsed faintly, distant but deliberate, a rhythmic blip against the static background, and my gut tightened at the thought of moving toward it alone. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by emergency lights, reflecting off the wet metal, while the Mariana Trench loomed silently outside, pressing against every beam of the platform. I whispered Rule 10 to myself, reminding myself that even the faintest curiosity could awaken something ancient, patient, and observant in the darkness below. I hesitated, flashlight in hand, scanning the corridor ahead for signs of movement, familiar or otherwise. The sonar ping continued, irregular now, as if measuring my hesitation and calculating my approach. Each vibration beneath my boots seemed to resonate with the blip, creating a rhythm I couldn't decipher. I reminded myself of Rule 10, understanding that this rule wasn't merely caution, it was survival. Approaching an unknown signal without a teammate nearby meant stepping into an unseen trap, a potential ambush in a place where the trench itself felt alive, aware and deliberate. Minutes passed as I monitored the signal, trying to interpret its pattern, and the platform shifted subtly under my feet with every current pulse. I imagined the unseen entities that could be associated with such a signal, lurking just beyond the emergency lights, moving slowly in the black water, patient and deliberate. The sonar ping seemed almost sentient, echoing through the metal and water, and I felt the pressure of Rule 10 like a physical weight on my shoulders. Every instinct screamed to wait, to call for backup, but curiosity tugged at the edges of my resolve. The abyss beyond the platform seemed to ripple in response to my thoughts, black and silent, a presence that observed, judged, and remembered. I approached the edge of the sonar console cautiously, tracing the signal's origin as my heartbeat synchronized with the irregular pings. I whispered Rule 10, reminding myself that the abyss did not forgive recklessness. The black water outside rippled strangely, shadows stretching unnaturally across the platform, and the vibrations from the main cables beneath me pulsed in sync with the sonar. I could imagine the fate of anyone who had approached such signals alone, the horror of vanishing without a trace, and the crushing realization that disobedience could awaken something beyond human comprehension. Hours blurred as I analyzed the blips, cross-referencing with past readings and environmental data. The signal remained mysterious, faintly rhythmic, almost teasing, and every instinct in my body screamed at me not to move forward alone. I repeated Rule 10 quietly to steady my nerves, acknowledging that survival in the trench demanded patience and adherence to these rules. Shadows stretched longer across the walls, and the vibration from the support beams seemed amplified, as if responding to my attention on the signal. Even the faintest lapse could draw unseen attention, and the thought made my pulse quicken. At one point, the sonar ping shifted sharply, becoming irregular, and I froze in place, gripping the console with tense hands. I whispered Rule 10 again, imagining what could be lying just beyond the illuminated corridor, waiting for any movement to guide it. The cables above pulsed faintly, the platform groaned under the water pressure, and the black abyss outside seemed to ripple with expectation. I reminded myself that approaching alone would have been catastrophic, that the rule existed because even a subtle interaction with unknown entities in the trench could end a life instantly. Every nerve was on edge, every shadow seemed alive, and the sonar blip continued its silent, menacing rhythm. Hours stretched further as I maintained my position, eyes alternating between the console, the flashlight, and the black water beyond. The platform's vibrations echoed like a heartbeat through the metal, and I felt the trench's presence pressing from all sides. I imagined past divers who had ignored Rule 10, disappearing into the unknown, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The abyss was patient, precise, and unforgiving, and every flicker of light, every subtle vibration reminded me that I was only alive because I had followed the rules. Whispering Rule 10 became a rhythm, a tether to reality, and a shield against the ever-present dark beyond the platform. Finally, the signal faded, the sonar returning to the steady background hum, and I allowed myself a tentative exhale. The platform seemed quieter now, but the shadows lingered, moving subtly as though satisfied with my restraint. I documented every anomaly in my log, transmitted the readings to the surface team, and felt the weight of obedience to Rule 10 settle over me. Even as I attempted to rest later, my mind replayed the blips, the vibrations, and the ever-present black water, a reminder that approaching unknown signals without backup was a gamble no diver in the Mariana Trench could afford to take. Survival had been preserved once again, thanks to adherence to the rules, but the patient abyss remained, watching, waiting, remembering. The sonar blips had faded, and yet a subtle unease pressed against me from every corner of the platform, reminding me of Rule 11. Never follow the moving shadows outside the platform, a warning that now felt more immediate than ever. Beyond the railing, the water pulsed in dark, twisting shapes that defied logic, shadows sliding slowly against the weak glow of emergency lights. My flashlight caught fleeting glimpses of movement, too deliberate to be mere reflections, too fluid to be mechanical, and my instincts screamed to stay rooted, obeying Rule 11 to survive. Every nerve in my body was taut with tension, as I realized that curiosity here wasn't just dangerous, it was lethal. I moved cautiously along the platform, my eyes fixed on the black water, refusing to track the shadows that beckoned with unnatural intent. The vibrations from the main cable pulsed in harmony with the shapes outside, a subtle rhythm that made my heart race. I whispered Rule 11 repeatedly, letting the words anchor me, even as every instinct screamed to investigate. The trench seemed aware, alive, pressing silently against the metal platform, judging my focus and patience. Shadows stretched and twisted, moving independently yet with a purpose, as if attempting to lure me into the abyss beyond the safety of the rails. Hours dragged on, each movement measured, each breath deliberate, as I maintained my vigil without following the hypnotic shadows. The emergency lights flickered intermittently, elongating every shape, every ripple in the water, giving them a life that was terrifyingly convincing. I reminded myself of Rule 11, aware that even a fraction of attention diverted toward the dark figures could trigger consequences too terrible to imagine. The platform groaned softly beneath the pressure of the deep ocean, and the vibrations through the beams and cables felt almost like a heartbeat, reminding me that I was being tested again and again by the trench itself. At one point, the largest shadow slowed and seemed to hover near the railing, perfectly still, almost waiting for me to glance in its direction. My pulse quickened, but I refused to break Rule 11, staring straight ahead at the steel platform instead. The faint hum of machinery mixed with the irregular thrum of the support beams, creating a rhythm that seemed alive, aware, and patient. I could feel the trench pressing against every side of the platform, black water curling unnaturally at the edges of the emergency lights. The sense of being watched was absolute, and I realized that the shadows weren't mere phenomena, they were conscious, deliberate, and capable of observing my obedience with precision. Minutes turned into hours, the platform vibrating faintly as currents shifted the water outside, moving the shadows subtly, yet purposefully. I whispered Rule 11 over and over, each repetition a lifeline, a reminder that survival depended on restraint, not curiosity. My mind raced with possibilities of what could happen if I gave in to the impulse to follow, imagining the abyss opening to swallow me, the shadows pulling me into an ancient, patient darkness that remembered every violation of the rules. Even the faintest lapse of focus seemed magnified here, every heartbeat measured by the unseen eyes in the water beyond. The black water shifted again, thicker now, almost suffocating, and the shadows moved in unison, as if orchestrated by a will I could not comprehend. I clutched the railing tighter, whispering Rule 11, fighting the urge to look, to step closer, to investigate. Every shadow that moved, every ripple in the water, seemed designed to test my discipline, to tempt me into a fatal curiosity. The trench pressed in, silent yet overwhelming, teaching me once again that patience and adherence to the rules were the only defenses against what lurked beyond the platform. Hours passed, my body trembling from fatigue, yet my mind remained locked in focus, obeying Rule 11 with grim determination. I recorded observations in the log, careful not to glance at the shifting shapes outside, noting every vibration and mechanical hum as a method to anchor myself. The shadows seemed to twist and coil, stretching unnaturally, with the faint flicker of lights, and the blackness beyond felt as alive as any organism, patient, aware, and deliberate. I realized that the trench didn't need to act immediately. It could wait, silent and patient, testing, measuring, and remembering. As the night deepened, the shadows began to form patterns that were almost familiar, shapes resembling something human yet impossibly wrong. My pulse raced, but I kept my eyes fixed on the steel platform and repeated Rule 11 in my mind like a mantra, knowing that even a fleeting glance toward those shapes could be my undoing. The vibrations beneath me intensified subtly, almost as if the trench itself was approving my restraint, yet warning me that disobedience would have no mercy. Every second felt elongated, each movement deliberate, the air thick with tension as if the abyss itself was alive and aware of my every breath. Finally, exhaustion forced me to take a moment of respite. In a small alcove of the platform, flashlight resting across my knees, hands shaking, the shadows outside lingered, dark and patient, moving in ways I could never anticipate. Yet I remained still, whispering Rule 11 quietly, unwilling to give in to the temptation to follow. The cables pulsed faintly above, support beams vibrated subtly, and the trench seemed to watch, patient, infinite, and unyielding. I realized that survival wasn't about courage, it was about discipline, about obeying the rules, even when every instinct screamed to disobey. I transmitted my final log to the surface team, voice calm but trembling, careful to note every anomaly, every vibration, and every fleeting shadow. Even as I attempted to rest later, the darkness outside remained, black and infinite, reminding me that Rule 11 had saved me, yet the abyss was patient, eternal, and unforgiving. I knew that each subsequent dive, each time I walked the platform, the shadows would return, waiting, measuring, and remembering every hesitation. Obedience had preserved me, but the trench would always linger, watching, waiting for the moment I faltered. The night ended without incident, yet the feeling of being observed never left me. I knew that disobedience to Rule 11 would be permanent, a mistake with consequences no one could survive. The Mariana Trench remained patient, indifferent yet aware, and as I drifted into uneasy sleep, the shadows lingered, dark and alive, a final silent reminder that some forces beyond comprehension could not be challenged. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.